I have covered many of the challenges and controversies surrounding Captain Herbert Sobel, but one question has remained unresolved. Did Sobel actually parachute into Normandy, and did he see combat after landing? While Richard Winters consistently dismissed the idea that Sobel was ever in Normandy, one member of Easy Company claimed to have encountered his former commanding officer during the early hours of June 6, 1944. In recent times, images of Herbert Sobel with General Maxwell Taylor in Carentan has dispelled any doubt that Sobel really was in Normandy. Ed Mauser was aboard Plane 69. Shortly after 1 a.m., his C-47 crossed the French coastline and immediately came under German anti-aircraft fire. Flak bursts exploded dangerously close to the aircraft, but fortunately the fuselage remained intact. As the danger intensified, men began shouting for everyone to get out as quickly as possible. The paratroopers stood, hooked up their static lines, and prepared to jump while the pilot desperately maneuvered to avoid streams of 20mm tracer fire. According to Mauser, the aircraft rapidly descended from approximately 1,500 feet to just 400 feet while traveling at high speed. When the green jump light finally illuminated, he exited the aircraft. The force of the propeller blast violently snapped his head backward. Decades later, he joked that his neck still hurt from the experience. As he drifted toward the ground, he witnessed the destruction of Plane 66. Reflecting on the loss years later, Mauser expressed regret, saying that Lieutenant Thomas Meehan should never have been aboard that aircraft. He lamented the irony that the non-commissioned officers had succeeded in removing Sobel from command, only for Meehan to be killed at just 21 years of age. After landing, Mauser spotted a figure approaching through the darkness. Unsure whether the individual was friend or enemy, he pulled out his cricket clicker and sounded it once. The man responded correctly. It was Sergeant Robert Burr Smith, who greeted him by saying, "Join the club." At that moment, Mauser realized he was no longer alone. The two men began moving inland, away from Utah Beach. During their advance, inaccurate German mortar rounds landed nearby, although the enemy soon abandoned the area. Remarkably, the next paratrooper they encountered was Captain Herbert Sobel himself. Mauser always maintained that Sobel had jumped into Normandy, despite widespread claims to the contrary. He insisted that he personally saw him there. There is documentary evidence that supports Mauser's account. General Order No. 12 from the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment Headquarters lists Sobel among the officers awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge for exemplary conduct while facing the enemy. According to Mauser, Sobel quickly assumed command of the small group. His instructions were simple and direct: "Follow me." As captain, his authority was unquestioned, and both men obeyed. While moving through the countryside, Mauser noticed a camera lying on the ground and bent down to pick it up. Sobel immediately warned him not to touch it, fearing it could be booby-trapped. Following the warning, Mauser tied a string to the camera and pulled it from a safe distance. Nothing happened. Mauser later recalled that Sobel may have kept the camera afterward. Not long after, Sobel separated from the group once their location became clearer. Unfortunately, Robert Burr Smith never described his D-Day experience in his memoirs, meaning Mauser's story cannot be independently confirmed through Smith's testimony. Nevertheless, as Mauser pointed out, numerous documents exist that indicate Sobel did indeed parachute into France on June 6, 1944. At the same time, some accounts claim that he did not jump at all and instead came ashore on Utah Beach with a supply unit. Given the available evidence, that explanation appears less convincing. So what actually happened? The final confirmed mention of Sobel before D-Day places him at the parachute training school in October 1943. He then seemingly disappears from the historical record until September 1944, when Easy Company prepares for Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. Neither the television series nor Stephen Ambrose's book provides any information about Sobel's activities during the intervening months. Richard Winters later wrote that he only saw Sobel once after his transfer from Easy Company. That meeting occurred in March 1945, when Sobel was promoted to the position of Regimental S4. Despite the uncertainty surrounding many aspects of his wartime service, evidence strongly suggests that Sobel did, in fact, jump into Normandy. An official Army document dated June 15, 1944, records that Sobel received the Combat Infantryman Badge while attached to Service Company 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. It appears that every officer who made the jump received the award regardless of whether they engaged directly in combat on D-Day. Even so, the document confirms that Sobel parachuted into Normandy alongside the regiment. But what about the long-standing story that he personally destroyed a German machine gun position? A newspaper article published in the Pittsburgh Press on June 15, 1944, supports that claim. According to the report, Captain Herbert M. Sobel of Chicago landed near Saint-Omer-du-Mont during the invasion. Under intense machine gun fire, he gathered 4 men, attacked a German machine gun emplacement with grenades, and successfully eliminated the position. The article further stated that the group later linked up with the rest of the division and had been fighting near Carentan ever since. This account aligns with Sobel's military record, which shows that he received both the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart during June 1944. However, one detail remains puzzling. There is no known location called Saint-Omer-du-Mont in Normandy. Given wartime censorship and operational security measures, it is possible that the newspaper used an incorrect or deliberately altered place name. For many years, I assumed Sobel had returned to England shortly after D-Day, especially since he eventually reappeared at Chilton Foliat. However, another newspaper article dated July 29, 1944, confirms that he remained in Normandy until the regiment was finally withdrawn and sent back to England. This also suggests that whatever wound earned him the Purple Heart was relatively minor, since he remained on active duty with the unit, in what can only be described as a surprisingly thoughtful gesture. Sobel later sent a letter to the Orchard News in Nebraska. Published on August 11, 1944, the letter was addressed to a relative of a paratrooper who had been tragically killed by friendly fire on D-Day. What makes the letter particularly unusual is that wartime censorship generally discouraged public discussion of friendly fire incidents. Sobel openly acknowledged the circumstances surrounding the soldier's death. At the time, Sobel was identified as the commanding officer of Service Company. This raises another interesting question. Why was he eventually reassigned back to Chilton Foliat rather than remaining in command of Service Company? The answer remains unclear. Likewise, it is unknown why he chose to jump into Normandy in the first place. One explanation suggests that Sobel's responsibility was to ensure that supplies arriving from the beaches successfully reached the regiment inland. Supporting this possibility, Popeye Wynn later recalled seeing Sobel driving a jeep while Wynn was being evacuated from Utah Beach after being wounded at Brecourt Manor. If Sobel did make the jump, perhaps permission was granted because of his status as the founding commander of Easy Company and his long association with the regiment. The final known reference to Herbert Sobel appears in the Chicago Tribune on July 8, 1953. The article reported that Colonel Herbert M. Sobel was supervising activities on the firing range for the 85th Division. The division had served since World War I and, by 1953, formed part of the U.S. Army Reserve. Since the unit was based in Chicago, where Sobel lived, his involvement in its post-war reorganization is hardly surprising. Following the war, Sobel also worked in civilian life as a credit manager for a telephone equipment company. He eventually retired from the Army in 1960. Herbert Sobel passed away in September 1987 at the age of 75, bringing to a close one of the most debated and controversial military careers associated with Easy Company and the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment.